Dontayvion Wicks. Over the offseason during the summer, you heard myself and other analysts talk about contingent upside. Most players in fantasy football just have one, maybe two teammates who offer injury upside. If the teammate gets hurt, that player gets a bump in work. But in Green Bay, all of the wide receivers had multiple injury outs. If one player got hurt, the other guys would be more full-time players in that offense. And that's what we're seeing right now with Dontayvion Wicks. Christian Watson unfortunately suffered an ankle injury. He could miss several weeks. And Watson's injury allowed Wicks to up his route participation to 80% after seeing rates around 45% in weeks 1 through 3. That led to more production. He had a 24% target share on Sunday. He had 24.8 PPR points. Dontayvion Wicks had a really good rookie season. His yards per route run was above 2. That's a number that was hit by just 26 qualified rookie wide receivers since 2011. Many of those year one wideouts who got to that number were very successful in the NFL throughout their career. So Dontayvion Wicks is going to have a bigger role in this offense with Christian Watson sidelined. And the Packers have a great schedule upcoming. They have matchups against the Rams, Cardinals, Texans, Jags, and Lions over their next 5. At this moment in time, all of those teams rank in the top 13 in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers favorably. It wouldn't be surprising if Wicks performs well. And given his age, his early career numbers, he could just carve out a bigger role in this offense, even when Christian Watson returns. And then obviously this Watson injury, also good news for people who have Jaden Reed and Romeo Doubs. Add Tucker Kraft. So another Packer who absolutely needs to be rostered right now in the majority of leagues is Tucker Kraft. It's tough at tight end right now. It's tough to find a tight end with Tucker Kraft's peripherals. He's now hit a 15% target share in 3 consecutive games, and his route participation saw a spike in week 4. It was around that 60%, 70% range for the first 3 weeks of the year. It was 86% in week 4. He is Green Bay's tight end 1, and that matters because Jordan Love is back under center. Add Emanuel Wilson. So apparently this week's 15 Transactions episode is sponsored by the Green Bay Packers. But for real, Emanuel Wilson, he deserves a shout this week. I talked about him a bit on last week's 10 Trends episode. So this is a little promotion to tell you to listen to that episode as well, not just the 15 Transactions one. But I noted that he was digging into Josh Jacobs' role a little bit more than we expected. And that continued in week 4, even with Jordan Love back. Wilson has seen running back rush shares of 41% and 47% over his last 2 games. And it got me thinking, everyone's really excited about Bucky Irving right now and his usage, which you should be. But Emanuel Wilson's usage hasn't been that much different than Bucky Irving's. It's just that Irving's competition is easier to overcome. Josh Jacobs is better than Rachaad White. But strictly from a current usage standpoint, like what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, Wilson's backfield share numbers haven't been that far off from Bucky Irving's. And why have we been targeting Bucky Irving? Because he can be a flex play, but he also has that contingent upside. Wilson is the Packers' number 2 running back right now with Marshawn Lloyd on IR. If Josh Jacobs were to go down, Emanuel Wilson would become Green Bay's top running back. They'd probably make some moves and do a little bit more to that backfield, but he would be the RB1. Again, he's not as intriguing as someone like Bucky Irving, because a backfield takeover is almost definitely not going to happen in Wilson's case. That could happen in Irving's case. But Wilson's a backup running back who's getting work, and that makes him roster worthy. Drop Mark Andrews. Now look, I said this at the beginning of the season, but I don't like taking wins and losses as the season's going forward. Like, it's only week 4. We're only going into week 5. We don't know if things are right or wrong just yet. But also, who cares right now? We have all offseason to talk about what went right and what went wrong. I'll do podcasts on both of those things because I care about my process and how I got to the conclusions that I got to. With that being said, Mark Andrews, he's an L. A massive, massive L. It's probably going to go down as my biggest miss of this season because I thought Mark Andrews, where he was being drafted, was a pretty good draft pick. And that was entirely wrong. There was some hope after week 1. The Ravens had a game plan where they took what they were given. They targeted their running backs at a really high rate, and Isaiah Likely was the one who benefited most from their 2 tight end sets. But Andrews' peripherals in that game, I talked about that on the show. I sent an email about this. His overall usage in that game still looked better than Isaiah Likely's, aside from targets. And because Baltimore lacks depth at pass catcher, it was reasonable to think that they were going to run a lot of 12 personnel this year. That would make both of those tight ends viable in fantasy football. Even that was wrong. I've gotten to the point where I just cannot predict this Todd Monken offense. It's very, very difficult to do. Andrews has seen pathetic route participation over his last 2 games. He's been under the 50% mark in both of those outings. He's only fallen below that mark throughout his career when he's been injured. Now here's the thing. Game script has definitely played a role here. Look at their last 2 games. The Ravens faced the Cowboys in week 3, and they were up 21-3 in the second quarter. The Cowboys have also been beatable on the ground. Baltimore went with a run-heavy approach. Then look at what happened on Sunday night. It was the exact same story. Second quarter, Baltimore's up 21-3. Buffalo is another team that you can run on. They're the 3rd worst team in expected points added per rush allowed. So it was another Derrick Henry-focused plan. That meant less Mark Andrews. So because of that, because of the game script stuff in deeper formats, I do think that Andrews is still someone that you want on your bench because the tight end landscape is really bad. I think that there are going to be games where Mark Andrews is fine. It's just a matter of predictability. We're not going to know when Baltimore is going to blow out their opponent. We're not going to know when a game's going to be close. We can predict it or we can try to predict it, but it's not going to be easy. And that's a huge, huge problem for both Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, and Zay Flowers for that matter. Because it's clear that this Monken offense is not going to be very predictable week over week. I mean, Justice Hill was on my sleeper show last week. I mentioned him as a sleeper. I didn't think he was going to see a 33% target share. That's crazy. But in a 10-team league, some 12-team leagues, I do think at this point, you can drop Mark Andrews because he's basically a streamer. Buy A.J. Brown. There's a very real chance that whoever has A.J. Brown in your fantasy league, that they're struggling right now. He hasn't played since week 1, and the Eagles have their bye in week 5. So take advantage. Brown should be back after the bye, and Philadelphia wide receivers, their short-term schedule isn't amazing, but they have the 3rd best schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed from now through the end of the fantasy season. Your league mate with Brown might be in a bad spot, so like I said, now is the time to take advantage. Add Trey Sermon. Jonathan Taylor suffered a mild high ankle sprain on Sunday against the Steelers. His availability is now up in the air. Next man up for Indianapolis, Trey Sermon. He carried the ball 5 times. He was not effective, but he did carry the ball 5 times against the Steelers in week 4. Now, Sermon's not some special running back, and it's no guarantee that he'd see a bell cow workload if Jonathan Taylor misses time. But the Colts do get a decent matchup in week 5 against the Jags. They're the 4th best opponent for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So at the very least, we should be adding Sermon off the waiver wire. Sell Xavier Worthy. With Rashee Rice out of the picture for Kansas City, someone's going to need to step up. And that someone might be Xavier Worthy, right? He could hypothetically be that guy. Look at all the other wide receivers on that roster and tell me which one you're going to get excited about. Worthy's the only one, and he scored well in my Zap model. Now, I would anticipate his target share rising a bit with Rashee Rice sidelined. But this isn't some simple replacement of Rice being out and Worthy just slotting in and seeing a massive target share. Rice was playing over 50% of his snaps from the slot, according to PFF. His average at the target was just 5.2 yards. Patrick Mahomes on the season has the lowest ADOT in the league. His rate of throwing at 20-plus air yards also the lowest in the league. Now, of course, this is partially driven by Rashee Rice himself. Having Rice out of the slot is going to lower that ADOT. But Worthy isn't all of a sudden going to play that role. And as a first-year player who's been used vertically so far, he's probably not going to start commanding like a 25% target share in this offense. Through the first month of the season, his target share has been about 13%. And Andy Reid sort of hinted at this on Monday. When asked about Worthy stepping up in Rashee Rice's absence, Reid said, quote, "We'll see how he does. He doesn't have to be the only one. We've got a good group of guys there that we can utilize. We normally spread the ball around, and that's what we'll continue to strive to do. And shout out to Coach Speak Index for that clip. Worthy's the kind of player who may actually benefit from having a teammate like Rashee Rice. It allows him to be freer down the field, and we need those down the field targets, those down the field shots for Xavier Worthy to be a great fantasy asset, at least at this point in his career. The Chiefs could also go out and trade for a wide receiver. That was also reported on Monday. If that happens, the hope for a massive target share increase goes away a little bit for Xavier Worthy. The bottom line here is that Worthy's role should probably get a little bit better. But there may be managers out there who think that it's going to get a lot better. And while that is in his range of outcomes, I don't think it's probable. So I'd be open to at least testing the market this week. Add Kareem Hunt. This Chiefs backfield, it's going to be a headache all season more than likely. But in week 4, Kareem Hunt got a lot of work, so I got to call him out. Carson Steele fumbled early in that game. That probably played a role in Hunt seeing 2/3 of the team's running back rushes. And look, Hunt wasn't that bad. He had a 50% success rate. He led the backfield in snaps as well, but not by that much over Samaje Perine. And then as I mentioned last week, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is eligible to return in week 5. So we'll see if that happens. But regardless of that outcome, Hunt's week 4 usage means that he likely should be rostered in most leagues. It's just I do think that projecting and forecasting forward, things are going to be pretty messy with this backfield from here on out. Drop Zamir White. So look, I understand in some leagues, letting a running back who saw 17 rush attempts in week 4, letting him to the waiver wire might be a poor idea. But in plenty of leagues, I do think that Zamir White can be dropped. White has seen a decent chunk of that backfield this year, but nothing's come of it. He's yet to score 7 PPR points in a single game, and he's seen more than 2 targets just once. No moderately relevant running back in football has a worse success rate through 4 weeks than Zamir White does. So he's been bad, and Alexander Mattison is likely going to see more work if this continues. Now, I understand that in your league, if it's deeper, if you can't afford it, then don't drop Zamir White. I get it. You know your league better than I do. But in a 10-team format, some 12-team formats, there are good upside stashes that are still sitting on the waiver wire. I would rather go in that direction, even though Zamir White might give me better production week in and week out. I'm looking at upside here. Zamir White's production, probably not going to be league winning, but he might just match a player like Braylon Allen. But Braylon Allen has way, way more upside than Zamir White does. So I'd much rather roster a player like that than Zamir White. Add Xavier Legette. The Panthers' offense has been completely different with Andy Dalton under center. Deontay Johnson's now living up to expectation, but in week 4, Xavier Legette got some looks too. He had a pretty good performance. Now, I talked about this on last week's Sleeper Show. I thought Legette was a decent play because he was likely going to play the perimeter across from Deontay Johnson. And that was a matchup to exploit. And according to PFF, Jonathan Mingo, he was the main slot guy for the Panthers in week 4. Legette took advantage of that matchup. He had a 25% target share and almost 20 PPR points. Now, as I always say on this show, when a rookie has a big outing, you want to be more aggressive than not and getting that guy off the waiver wire. When a young, unknown player does really well and he has a backbone of being a decent prospect, you want to get that player. That's sort of what we're looking at with Xavier Legette. But I do want to keep in mind that this week 4 matchup was a good one for him. Things won't necessarily be as good in week 5 because they get Chicago. And Chicago's been the 3rd toughest matchup for wide receivers this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed. But regardless, you should be adding Legette. Add Wan'Dale Robinson. So another player on the Sleeper Show last week was Wan'Dale Robinson. He had a good slot matchup against the Cowboys, and he took advantage. He had a 36.8% target share. He scored 18.1 PPR points. Wan'Dale Robinson has a top 15 target share at wide receiver this year. Now, he's not going to win you leagues with a 4.8 average depth of target. He's not in an offense like Kansas City's where that's going to fly. But with Malik Neighbors around, it's opening up a lot of space for Robinson to operate underneath and out of the slot. And that could help him maintain a strong target share in that offense. If he's going to be well above the 20% target share mark, then he should be rostered in almost every league. So go at him this week. Add Add Josh Downs. So one more player from last week's sleeper show, Josh Downs. He had a great matchup against Pittsburgh, and he came through. He scored 22.2 PPR points. He's now seen target shares of 27.8% and 32.1% over his 2 games this year. He has that slot role on lock. The bigger problem is opposite of Michael Pittman. Alec Pierce is trying to hold off Adonai Mitchell. But Downs' role is very real, and he's a really good player. Anyone with that kind of target share, let alone a talented player with that kind of target share, should not be left on the waiver wire. Buy Brian Thomas. Sometimes you have to buy high in fantasy football, and one of those instances might be with Brian Thomas. The Jags offense has not been great to start the year, but they've also faced a bottom 5 schedule for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed, and they've gone up against the 3rd toughest wide receiver schedule. They've faced Miami, Cleveland, Buffalo, and Houston. Pre-Monday Night Football, 3 of those 4 teams rank as bottom 10 opponents for wide receivers. Again, that's by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Regardless of that, Brian Thomas has done quite well. He has a 21% target share that's solid, especially for a rookie wide receiver, and he's averaging 14.5 PPR points per game. Not only is he a rookie wide receiver, you guys, he's a young rookie wide receiver. Jacksonville's immediate schedule looks a lot better than what they faced the first month of the season. And they've got the 11th best schedule for wide receivers rest of season. It just feels like Brian Thomas right now is kind of flying under the radar, despite performing really, really well in kind of a bad offense. Add Justin Fields. So the Steelers in week 4 faced a serious negative game script for basically the first time all year. And Justin Fields delivered, in fantasy football at least. He ran the ball 10 times for 55 yards, and he scored twice on the ground. He currently ranks 4th in the league in adjusted completion percentage. He's now scored 18 and 32 standard fantasy points over his last 2 games. This is why I was excited earlier this season when Justin Fields became starter. The problem was that game scripts just didn't really favor what Justin Fields can do in fantasy. But last week it definitely did. And he's performing a lot better as a passer too, which is huge. Now, Pittsburgh's upcoming schedule isn't overly friendly for quarterbacks, especially in a few weeks they get the Jets. But there is some chance for some back and forth against the Cowboys here in week 5. So Fields could definitely work in the short term, but also the long term too. Add the Denver Broncos defense. The Broncos are at home this week, they're favorites, and they get the Raiders in a game with a sub 37 point over-under. Vegas has been the 6th best opponent for defenses this year by adjusted fantasy points allowed. And guys, Denver's playing really well defensively. They've been a top 5 team in EPA per play allowed, and they've been a top 10 defense in 3 of 4 games this year in fantasy football. So Denver's a very easy streaming choice this week.